Good evening. I'm ready to start. I'm a little late, but that's okay. So this plaque is uptown near the Diamond, and it says Adam Holliday and his brother William in 1768, traveling west from Lancaster County, stopped on this point, and Adam, driving a stake into the ground, remarked, "Whoever is alive 100 years from now will see a tolerable sized town here, and this will be near about the center of it." Adam served under Colonel Armstrong at Kittanning in 1756, under General Forbes at the capture of Fort Duquesne in 1758, built Fort Holliday, assisted in building Fort Fetter, was a member of both of the Committee of Safety and of Captain Paxton's Ranging Company of Bedford County, 1776. My name is Tom Kopriva, and I am part of the Hollidaysburg Heritage Guided Tour Committee. And since September, we've been cooperating and working with the library in presenting the History Hour. This actually is our best history hour so far, and that's before I start. So thanks for coming. I initially, when I moved here, I've lived here about 50 years now. When I moved here, I found the name Hollidaysburg rather annoying. It was a long word to write. It was a long word to type. I don't know how many times on the phone I had to respell it for people before they got it. 2 L's, there's a Y, there's an S. But now I fell in love with the town. And now that it's a hobby of mine, history, in my retirement, I've grown to really, really enjoy what Hollidaysburg was, is, and can be. In Hollidaysburg, I met my wife, Jolene. We raised a family of 3 kids. I found my dream career at the YMCA, and I discovered my retirement hobby, history. So I want to just do one disclaimer. This is not an academic dissertation. It's just me. All right, so now I need to set some context. So I'm going to go back a little bit in time just to set the context. In 1607, the first settlement in Jamestown happened. 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. 1682, Philadelphia was established. America's population in 1700 was 250,000 people. 50 years later, it was 1.2 million people. And that does not include all the indigenous people that were already here. What I need you to understand now is that this area, as the ABCD Corp has said and defined us as the first frontier, we were a wilderness area. There wasn't too many people living in this area, if any, and the wilderness was backed up against the Appalachian Mountains, so it was just hard to get here. But I need you to imagine, if you can, by closing your eyes, or if you have a great imagination, this vast area of pristine, old growth trees, no sounds of humanity, wildlife unaccustomed to people, and streams and flowers and fruit galore. It was just, I guess, a garden of paradise. But I now want to take you to 1754. We're still in this pristine condition. We're still in the wilderness condition. There we are. I got to remember to do this too. That's Pennsylvania. This is a relief map. So Hollidaysburg is right about there. If you're familiar, this right here is the West Loop. And so we're right about in here. Now you can see the mountains presented that barrier. So that, and then we were tucked into this wilderness area. I'm going to actually show you where Hollidaysburg is. My daughter Jennifer helped me put this PowerPoint. I wish she was here to click this thing. So there we are, right there. Now the big event that occurred was Fort Necessity, which is right down here in the lower part of Pennsylvania. Fort Necessity was a defining event for that time period. You can see, again, I'm going to use my clicker, that it is on the western side of the mountains. And here is the confluence of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers. So this was a point of control, and the British and the French were in a struggle for empire supremacy. So, and then coincidentally, George Washington, this is one of his first commands, came to Fort Necessity, built Fort Necessity, and then when vastly outnumbered by the French, surrendered Fort Necessity, which then set off, by the time that news got back to Europe, into the chairs and the thrones of England and France, they decided, well, we have to get serious about this. So Fort Necessity actually kicked off and ignited the 7-Year War that occurred in Europe. 1756 to 1763. But that was one big point, was right here at Fort Necessity. Then Fort Duquesne happened along. It was a French fort, and General Braddock tried to take Fort Duquesne and he failed at that attempt. What that did was encourage the Indians. You have to excuse me. I'm going to say Indians. I'm going to say Native Americans. I'm going to say indigenous people. It don't mean any slight to the people who lived here. But here's to you. So the Indians were smart enough to hold it back just long enough so they decided which side, the French or the British, were going to win. And so once Braddock failed to take Fort Duquesne, they decided to take to the hatchet. Take up the hatchet. And they then started doing raids, and I have Katanning up there because at that time, Katanning was the largest settlement, and I don't think that's the right word. I think it would be encampment. There was about 300 or 400 Indians living at Katanning. It was right there on the Allegheny Plateau along the Allegheny River. And they were led by two particular Lenape chiefs. One was Chief Shingus, and the other, don't know how he got this name, Chief Captain Jacobs. And I don't think that's an Indian name, but that's what's his name. They were rather brutal and notorious for what they did in attacking settlers. And they then used the Katanning Path to come down into this area, and any settlers that they could run into, they would attack, and it was quite a threat. Chief Captain Jacobs ended up at Fort Granville, which is near Lewistown, and put that fort under siege. And in the first day, they were able to kill the commander of that fort, and the second in command the next morning surrendered the fort to the Indians. The Indians then took some of the women and some of the children that they could, and as prisoners, and took them back to Kittanning. So you can just feel the tension between the settlers, the pioneers, and the colonial governments and the Native Americans building up. So then the commander that had been killed, his brother was Lieutenant Colonel John Armstrong, and he got together some troops and he was going to retaliate. So then he left Fort Shirley, which I don't have a label for, but it was in Huntington County. And he had 300 troops, and they went up through the Kittanning Pass and they conquered the Kittanning encampment. Lieutenant Colonel Armstrong became the hero of Kittanning, and the colonials figured that was a big, big victory. Now there was a couple things that needed to be understood about that fight. Is that one, the attackers suffered more casualties than the Indians. Most of the villagers actually escaped, and they took the Granville prisoners with them. That expedition aggravated the confrontations out in the frontier. It revealed to the Indians their vulnerability to the more powerful forces of the colonial people. And then Chief Shingus's brother, Tamaqua, really took up the banner for peace. And then within a couple years, there was a Treaty of Easton that sort of tried to settle that up. It took about 20 years for it really to be put into place. So that all happened in 1756. In 1758, General Forbes captured Fort Duquesne, rebuilt it, named it Fort Pitt. It changed the tide of the conflict. It broke the French and Indian alliance, and it opened up the Western Pennsylvania for settlers and settlement. Among Armstrong's troops were two soldiers. One was Adam Holliday, and the other was William Holliday. So that's how those two guys got here. Were in that area in the beginning. Now, I'm going to take it a little further back. That we probably now that know that as the United Kingdom. But so in the 16 and 1700s, England, wherever the crown was at that time, had this crown plantation movement. They confiscated all the land of Ireland. And then they wanted to colonize it, anglicize it, and control it. So they had it works. Most of the people that they put in as colonizers and as colonials in the plantation, and the largest plantation was Ulster. We're from northern England and southern Scotland. And for 100 years that went on, And then the people that came from Ulster were eventually called the Scotch Irish because they mixed. So that plantation movement, though it benefited the English crown in the beginning, it created centuries of tensions and combat, and we still hear about it. And you don't know where it started, but it started back here in the 16 and 1700s. But so that was bad enough. Then in 1741, there was a famine, one of the great famines in Ireland. It was very cold, and it had been cold for several years in a row, and it ruined their crops. And their main crops at that time were grains, corn, and potatoes. So now they're hungry. They don't have control of their land. And I have to mention that the lands were confiscated from Gaelic chiefs. And you can take that with what you want. So the famine, there's probably anywhere from 13 to 20% of the population of 2.4 million people died during the famine. And also along with the famine came some fatal diseases, and it just crushed that little country. So during that time period, the time period I'm referencing now would be the 50 years in the middle of the 1700s. 250,000 Irish immigrated, left. And just as a note for later on, simultaneously, the Palatine Germans, who were from the Palatine Church, they had been oppressed for off and on for about 100 years. They're looking to leave. And about the same number, about 250,000 of the Germans came to the New World. And so, guys are making me try. How's everybody going? So, the next thing I want to talk about and is the so here we are, Ireland, and here's where they're going to come to. They had to cross that ocean. Most of them came into New York or Philadelphia and spread out from there. Pennsylvania ended up with a lot of the people. And eventually they were coming in as just young people. Later we had the good fortune for us of the, after the Revolutionary War, a lot of the people that were coming were older, had skills, and ended up being foremen and entrepreneurs in our country. They sort of came over at the same time the Industrial Revolution in the United States was taking hold. And that helped them, not only helped them with jobs and supporting their families, but it helped our economy grow. So the next point I want to make for you is that this is how they crossed the ocean. These boats could have been anywhere from 100 to 100 feet long, 150 feet long. The trip would take 1 to 3 months based on the weather and the wind conditions. So they're also, you know how our industries just take hold. The agents of these ships and immigrant ships had their own reputations and stories. The agents would talk about how wonderful the New World was, all these opportunities, all these freedoms. And here's those poor people that were being suffering and deprived of so much, they jumped at the opportunity, which produced deplorable conditions. There could be 100 to 200 people crammed on the deck below, or is it the deck below the deck? I'm not in the Navy, I don't know how that is. So there were rampant sickness. In fact, I'm going to read another page to you, as well as put up on there. So these are actual reports from a voyager in 1750. The stench, the fumes, the horrors, the vomiting, many kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headache, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, rot mouth, and the like, all which came from old and sharply salted food and meat, also from very bad water, so that many died miserably. Add to this want of provisions, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, anxiety, wants, afflictions, lamentations, together with other troubles, as the lice abound so frightfully, especially on sick people, that they can be scraped off the body. The misery reached a climax when a gale rages for 2 or 3 nights and days, so that everyone believes that the ship will go to the bottom with all human beings on board. In such a visitation, the people cry and pray most piteously. No one can have an idea of the suffering which women in confinement have to bear with their innocent children on board these ships. Few of this class escaped with their lives. Many a mother is cast into the water with her child when she has passed away. One day, just as we had a heavy gale, a woman on our ship who was to give birth and could not give birth under these circumstances was pushed through a loophole in the ship and dropped into the sea because she was far in the rear of the ship and could not be brought forward. So when I say deplorable conditions, you're going to get an idea of that. 90 years later, when Charles Dickens, the famed writer, which we did a history hour on it in December, by Keith Eldridge, who's here, he reported 90 years after the 1750 crossing, he recorded these conditions that the immigrants suffered. Dressed in rags and destitute after selling their belongings to pay for passage, depended on others for food, lacked medical treatment, lived in packed, unsanitary conditions for the duration of the voyage. So how drastic, how desperate were these people to get on a wooden boat to go take 1 to 3 months trip across the ocean to get to the hope of land and freedom? I'm going to throw one other term in here at this point: indentured servant. You had to pay for your passage because of the dire economic conditions in Ireland at the time. I don't know if there was a whole lot of extra money. So you could sell your services to the ship's captain. And then when you got to the New World, to America, the captain would then auction you off. And just like the black slaves, they would separate families, you were just cartel. You could just, it was a miserable condition. And these indentured servants could be working for up to 6 years before they could have their own lives back. This was all years and years and years before we declared our independence from England. So we're up to 1950, and that would be when the Holliday brothers landed in the New World, in America. And I'm going to give you another map. We're not going to talk about that anymore. We got some other horrible stuff coming up. we're spacing it out. So this is, of course, Pennsylvania. And we're trying to see how our founding fathers, the founding fathers of Hollidaysburg, found their way. So we're not sure, I'm not sure how they paid for their passage. But they got here in 1950. According to the information I have.
1750, 1850.
You say.
So I hear 14. 17. You can wait for that. 1750. They showed up.
Just saying for listening.
But they, yeah, the test. So not sure how they paid for their passage, but we do know that they ended up in Lancaster County in the 1750. And as all immigrants were trying to do, they were trying to find the best land at the lowest price that they could get to. So we will get them to Lancaster. Now, I mentioned earlier, and I'm sure that you caught me on that date, that the feuds between the Germans and the Irish were so tough that the Holliday brothers decided we need to go further, we need to leave, we need to go somewhere else. Now, the things that a settler was looking for, they were looking for quality land. They were also looking for affordable price. Free was the best affordable price. They were looking for being further towards the wilderness so that the proprietors who controlled the land couldn't try to assess them rent or purchase price. And they, so the further away from Philadelphia, the better they felt. And the other thing was they wanted to be living with enough people that and I'm going to use another word for Indians, that the savages would not be able to threaten them. Strength in numbers. So from Lancaster, I'm ready, gentlemen. Kanokachik. So they went down there. They didn't know whether that was in Pennsylvania or Maryland. We now know that it was in Maryland. And so they stayed there. They stayed there till 1768. And again, they felt they needed to go further west. Now here, we go back to the fact that William and Adam were part of Lieutenant Colonel Armstrong's troops in his expedition to Kittanning. So they're familiar with this area over in here. And they decide that's where we'll go. Now, I want you to imagine one other thing here. William has 6 kids. It's a good chance his wife is pregnant. Adam does not have children at the time. They load everything they can on horseback and they head out into the wilderness. How much courage, how much fortitude that takes to go into the unknown. So they did that. And because of the Kittanning Trail, that was their destination. Because again, William really liked the land up here along the Allegheny River. So they went to Alwick, which is in Huntington County. They went to Standing Stone, which is the name known then, but it's Huntington now. And then they went to Frankstown. And they found nothing suitable in those three areas. So then they're making their way towards the containing basin. Now, let me take some of those back. So they're traveling here. This is the Susquehanna River. And this, I believe, is the Juniata River. Can you see that, Jim?
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes.
So they're probably traveling in valleys and along the rivers because that's the easiest way to get around. The rivers have cut their way through the mountains. So that's where they're going. But when Adam and William in their group, they reached Hollidaysburg, Adam says, this is as far as I need to go. This is where I want to stay. And William, still looking at those Allegheny Plateau lands, has to be convinced. So one of the arguments is that they don't know who owns that land, whether it's a proprietor from England or the Indians. So they're not sure if they get the Katanning, if they're going to have to buy their lands from one group, and if it's the Indians, they may end up needing to buy it again. And they weren't sure of the Indian situation over in this area. So they decided to stay in Hollidaysburg.
Was it already called Hollidaysburg? I thought they named it. So they went to Hollidaysburg. Was it already Hollidaysburg?
Oh, yeah. It wasn't going to be, I'm sorry, it wasn't going to be Hollidaysburg for a while. The Holiday Brothers. Yeah. I'm sorry. But where Hollidaysburg would be, they decided to stay there. And Adam chose 1,000 acres that were on the, I would say, the north side or the east side of the Beaver Dam branch of the Juniata River. And William went to the south side or the west side of that river. And that's where they picked up 1,000 acres. That land that the Holiday brothers purchased was part of the tract of land that Thomas and William Penn, descendants of William Penn, acquired from the Indians in a treaty at Albany in 1754. The only thing I can say right now about that treaty in Albany is it is probably more famous for an initiative that Ben Franklin tried to do and laid some of the foundations of how we could self-govern ourselves, which was years before the Declaration of Independence. But the point that I want to make is that in that conference in Albany in 1754, the Penns bought this land from a certain group of Indians, and there was some question whether the Indians they purchased that from actually owned it or controlled it. And so that there was still tensions and friction when the settlers went in there, because these are our lands. I mean, who could buy? Who could sell our lands? And we didn't want to do that. Which takes me to another point. Before I do that, I'm gonna have a drink. The land, the Penn tract, comprised the present counties of Blair, Bedford, Fulton, Huntington, Indiana, Mifflin, and Perry, and portions of Franklin, Snyder, Union, Center, and Somerset. And I don't know what the equivalent of a pound is then and now, but they paid 400 pounds for all that land, basically Western Pennsylvania. Adam and William bought their 1,000 acres for what would be $220. But the idea of the proprietors selling their land was that they could get settlers in there, they could get them established, and then they could control them with the colonial government and tax them. So that was the initial. I talked with oh boy, who's that? The township supervisor in Frankstown. What was his name? Joe Robins. He told me that they didn't have property tax in Frankstown Township for a purpose. Anybody live in Frankstown? He said they didn't have property taxes, but they had income taxes. So some of the more professional people, doctors, lawyers, they would buy land in Frankstown Township, but there no property tax. But he talks tax the income. So there's always a lead to why you want to get land out there. Now, the other point on that land is that there was no doubt in looking back that there was going to be a clash over private property. The Europeans came here knowing certain people owned the land, but the American natives, I mean, they had no idea that somebody could own land or control land or restrict the land. So there was definitely going to be clashes between those two groups. So that was one of the things. It took many years for property laws and systems to be established. The framers of our Constitution had the foresight to declare us a republic. A republic is a state with supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives, in which has an elected or nominated president rather than a monarch. This principle established the right of private ownership. So it was something that they saw that we needed to do and held on to. Now, just going to throw out some information right now. Hollidaysburg was founded in 1768. Holliday brothers came here in 1768. Wasn't Hollidaysburg. It was laid out in, you're going to like this one, Jim, maybe. It was laid out in 1780 or 1782 or 1790. There's claims of all those different years. Blair County established in 1846 when it was calved from Huntington County. So I need to talk a little bit more about the land records. Pennsylvania, remarkably, has one of the most reliable colonial documents available, just because they had a good system back then. Many early settlers went to vacant areas and established a homestead. And they felt they were out of the reach of the proprietors, and they took care of themselves that way. Remember that the immigration was really pumping up by then. We had 250,000 people in 1700. We have 1.2 million in 1750, and every year after 1750, our population grew by at least 600,000 people. So there was a lot of people trying to get there. In 1765, the colonial government set up a new policy. If you were a squatter, you could get a legal title by applying for a warrant and then getting the patent by accepting the terms that you would pay what the original purchase price would have been, plus interest. And then it would be yours free and clear. The way you did that, an application for a warrant was submitted by the buyer, and that went to an office, and I don't know the details of that. And then if it was approved and accepted, then it was said you need to get, you were eligible to initiate or to acquire a survey. And the official survey had different terms in it that you had to satisfy. It could have been markers, it could have been descriptions, it could have been size, I'm not sure what. But that was a survey. And I remember George Washington was a surveyor earlier in his life. And so it must have been very important to have that talent. So then with the survey, you could send and submit an application for a patent. And when you received the patent, it was the official granting of full clear release and title. A little more information before I get to William and Adam. William Penn was born in 1644. He was the son of an admiral. William had converted to the religious sect Society of Friends, later known as Quakers. Although the Society of Friends was being persecuted as a religious sect in England, William was socially accepted a lot because one of his best friends was the Duke of York, who would later become the King James II. King Charles, who was on the throne at that point, had been lent money by William's father, 16,000 pounds. Penn, seeking a haven for his sect, asked for land to be granted, and with the Duke's support, his friend the Duke of York, he was granted in 1681 the charter for Pennsylvania. And then the king, in honor of his friend, the admiral, named it Pennsylvania. They wanted it just the name Sylvania, and then he added Pennsylvania. A man in 1682, William Markham, became the first agent of Pennsylvania 1 year after Philadelphia was laid up. So now that's all the context, that's all the background. So now we have William and Adam in our land right now, which will be Hollidaysburg, which will be Blair County, which will be much more what we understand. We're trying to understand them as individuals. You have seen that they left in dire conditions in Ireland. They felt it was the best option for them to get on one of those boats and sail across the ocean for 1 to 3 months, come to a new country with little or nothing, and start all over again. Once they got here, once they got to this point, they participated in the French and Indian Wars. We know that because they went to Canadian on that expedition. They were with Forbes when he finally captured Fort Duquesne. They were just amazing people. They lived through that historic famine. They crossed that ocean when as many as 1 out of 2 people didn't survive. They were probably at that time about 5'5". A couple generations before, the average height was 5'7", but I guess with all the food shortages at that time, the average height dropped a couple inches. They were probably unshaved. Hair was probably a little crazy. They wore the typical dress of the people at that time. Mainstays of pioneer diet were simple fare like potatoes, beans, and rice. Hardtack, which is simply flour, water, a teaspoon of salt and sugar, then baked, or soda biscuits, flour, milk, and 1 teaspoon each of carbonate of soda and salt. Cornbread, cornmeal mush, bread. The Hollidays were, without doubt, the most Western settlers in this part of the country at that time. Now, with a little lapse of time, a lot of the valleys and areas started being polka dotted with different settlers, farmers, mostly. Hollidaysburg, Hollidays. I don't think it may have been called Hollidaysburg at one point, I think, but it was still a very small place. In 1830, there were only 72 people who lived here. The biggest thing that happened for Hollidaysburg was there was always traffic going east to west. But then they needed to do more, so the Huntington-Cambria, Indiana Turnpike was created. And it pretty much follows Route 22. I believe if you go down to New Alexandria, their main street is still part of the original path. And it went through across Allegheny Street and then up through the Blair Gap. And so when that turnpike was commissioned, and then they made it I think it was 22 feet wide, and there was 1 or 2 feet of crushed stone that made it just a little better to travel on. But we had a stagecoach stop in Hollidaysburg. That was the only activity we really had. In fact, when the canal came from 1825 to 1831, they were trying to figure out where to put the canal. They wanted to put it in Frankstown, but they couldn't get the land, so they moved up to Hollidaysburg. And when the first boat came into Hollidaysburg, they had to go back to Frankstown to celebrate because there wasn't a place big enough. So now I'm going to talk about William Holliday. He was born in Scotland in 1730. He died at the age of 66 in 1796. We're going to go back. There they are. Adam and William. I wanted to put this up earlier. These are some of the skills, talents that you had to have be a pioneer. In one of my presentations on our tours, we do the guided tours, and someone asked me, well, what did the women do? And there's not a way that you couldn't have a full partnership of a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, to do all these different things for your family to survive and prosper. So, okay, Adam's gone, William's there. All right, born in Scotland, 1730, died in 1796. He was the son of John and Jean Holliday. When he and Mary, I mentioned it earlier, when they moved from Coachee in 1768, they had 6 children, and Mary was probably pregnant. William's 10 children were born between his 19th and 39th birthday. 2 years, and this probably would have been a big deal, a big event. 2 years after he settled in the Hollidaysburg area, William was a congregation member, hosted a Dr. John King. He had been pastor for 43 years at the Presbyterian Church of Upper West Conochie near Mercerburg for a meeting in his 1770 missionary tour to the Alleghenies. This was 60 or 70 years before Father Gallitzin came into this area. So although John William devoted much of his time to cultivation of his farm with his sons, he had 7 sons, he was also active in the work of repelling attacks of the ruthless indigenous natives. Of note with William, soon after the Revolutionary War commenced, his second son, James, joined the Continental Army. James was a noble-looking young man who attained the lieutenant's commission. He was engaged in several battles and presented himself well. He was killed at the Battle of Brandywine. And the Hessian that shot him was soon taken care of by one of his friends. William probably took a little bit of a backseat to his brother Adam, but he did sign a petition that was sent to the Continental Congress, and it was dated May 29th, 1779, and he was addressing the horrible conditions that existed here and how much help they needed from the Continental government. He, unfortunately, that petition was not answered. He also served as a paymaster for the Bedford County Militia. Now, this is another horrible chapter in the story, but on August 9th, 1781, you have to go back to that imagination of how idyllic this area was. There had been a threat of Indians, so most of the settlers in this area at that time were living near Fort Roberdeau, and but it was getting to be the fall, of course, August, and William felt he had to get his hay cut and put in the barn. So he did that. He went out one time and cut it and got some of it put away, and then he went back to Fort Roberdeau. And then they didn't hear any reports or sightings of Indians in the area, so they I got a lot more to tell you. So they went back a second time, and a soldier named McDonald came, and they were talking about the Revolutionary War, and this is 1781. And before they knew it, they heard this thunder, this clap, and some Indians were hidden in the woods in the thicket. And the two boys were shot. The girl was shot, and William's horse was shot out from underneath him. So as they had been distracted, but then boom, they were moving. McDonald approached the Indian saying, "Friend, friend, friend," and William Holliday didn't think that was going to work. So he was taken off. The horse was shot out from underneath him. He ends up with McDonald's horse, saw his daughter, and tried to scoop her up. The two warriors grabbed her, pulled her away from him, and with a tomahawk killed her. So McDonald was captured and released after the Revolutionary War, and William on this horse, and it's all this commotion, takes off, and they both wander around overnight. And the next morning, William shows up at Fort Roberdeau, no hat, no shoes, his clothes are all tattered. He's lacerated, he's bleeding, he doesn't recognize the sentry. It takes him hours to figure out took them hours to figure out what happened. They sent out a group, but they never did catch up to him. All those Indians did later go down to Morrison Cove. They killed some more people. They went to Dunning's Creek. They killed some more people or shot at some other people. They did send a battalion out to see if they could catch up with them, but they never did. It was not a very good chapter in our story. I'm going to have to keep going here. So James, Adam, and Janet, and it was considered a massacre. And I hope I have enough time, but I'm going to say it right now. My friend Janine Treese gave me a paper recently, and it's by Robert and Catherine Emerson, and he proves that the year was wrong. 1781. It could not have happened because of some military records and so forth. The actual year of this attack was 1779. And it's a very interesting story. So we dropped William, now we're going to talk about Adam. He was born in the Annandale district of Scotland in 1728, making him 2 years older than his brother William. He had a son, John, born in 1843, and a daughter born in, no, John was born in 1780, died 1843. Mary was born 1783, died 1865. He was very active in the frontier defense, as we read on the initial plaque. And he did a lot of good things for the community. He had what I call a silver lined calamity. So what happened? And that's why I spent some time on the land grants and documents and so forth. A guy named Harry Gordon, also from Scotland, shows up. His farm is beautiful, and researchers the records find that there's some errors in the paperwork, and then he files claim or applies for a warrant and gets it. So he now owns the land, Adam doesn't. And it goes back and forth in the courts. And it was finally decided that Harry Gordon owned this 1,000 acres. Then the next nice thing happened, the Revolutionary War. So Harry Gordon, as a loyalist, he takes the first boat and goes back to England. He's then declared a traitor. And there's an auction of his lands. Everybody knows his story. It couldn't have been that many people. But most of them knew his story, and no one bid against him. So he gets his land back. Then the next thing, the war is over. Revolutionary War is over. Harry Gordon goes back. He can prove that he did not take arms up against the colonists, and he's given his land back. But the terms of the treaty of the Revolutionary War, I guess it was the United States then, had to pay Adam for his land before they gave it back to Harry Gordon. He ends up with $16,000, which was a fortune at that time. He's the wealthiest man in this area of Pennsylvania. When Adam died in 1801, he had the two heirs, John, his son, and Jane. And after the estate was settled, it was found that John was the richest man in this part of the country. So John married Mary, who was daughter of Lazarus Lowry in 1602. If you're familiar with the area, on the old road of 22 between here, Hollidaysburg, and Frankstown, there's a stone house. That was the Lowry house, the oldest stone house in Blair County. His daughter married John. John and Mary moved to Johnstown, but it wasn't Johnstown then. He bought the land and was there. It was laid out. It was christened Johnstown in his name, but he didn't seem to have any faith in that town. Maybe he didn't like water. So he sells his land and goes back to town. And he built this was a sketch. And wrong button. This is Allegheny Street. This is Montgomery Street. This was John Holliday's store and a John Adams, but I don't believe it was that John Adams. And what was good, this was this is the road that took them up over the mountain. So Teamsters and people traveling, they found this place, must have been a wild night here every night. But it became very successful. And some of you probably know this. The people that drove the wagons are called Teamsters, because the team of horses. I thought that was pretty good. So I'm going to do one more thing here. This was a testimonial that I drew from J. Simpson's Africa's book that he wrote in 1883, The History of Huntington and Blair Counties. Of William and Adam Holliday, the soldiers, pioneers, and Christians, but little more need or can be said. They were all in the relations of life good and highly respected citizens. Each attained to a ripe old age when at last they successfully lay down the cares and burdens of life, and their eyes had closed in the sleep that knows no waking. Their remains were reverently borne to the Hollidaysburg, I think it's Holliday burial grounds. There beside the children who were massacred in 1781, were placed beneath the mold of the valley they were first to improve. True, no marble slab or granite column marks their last resting place, but a more imperishable monument than could be produced with either exists in the fact that a beautiful little town standing where the Holliday brothers stood on that Memorial Day in 1768 still perpetuates their names. So that's the burial grounds. It's over near the Blair Township building. Those are the townhouses over there. So that's where the founding fathers of Hollidaysburg and their family are buried. So I wish I had more time to talk about the paper that Janine gave me. But it made me think that when you start talking about history, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, putting it together, except you don't have all the pieces on the table. You have to go find the pieces. And I would say if you want to do any history research, you want to go see Jim out the Blair County Genealogical Society. You want to get down to the historic Hollidaysburg Ink Museum on Walnut Street. The library has lots of information. History is so exciting. And if we weren't going to learn those lessons, what do they say? You're doomed to repeat. Man, we seem to be doing that. Jim told me, Jim Snyder, he's one of my heroes in history. He told me that Adam Holliday didn't really come and live in Hollidaysburg until the early 1700s. And if you think about all that stuff that went with he and Harry Gordon, maybe he went to Frankstown and lived out there for a while, because that's where his son was living. So there was lots of good information, Janine. Thank you very much. So now it's time. I'm sorry I'm a little late, but I really appreciate your time and attention for being here. And before you go, again, the Hollidaysburg Heritage Guided Tour